various countries around the world. Donate online at africamuslimsagency.co.za. Africa Muslims Agency, empowering, educating, inspiring.
The Breakfast Rush, brought to you courtesy of the Willowton Group, at the forefront of innovation, and one of the leading competitors in the African FMCG market.
It's 7:15 this Monday morning. We're live on YouTube, live on Facebook, and live inside your radio as well. A political analyst has suggested that the influence of Labour Federation COSATU and the SACP on government policy and legislation is set to take a knock after the ANC lost its outright majority. The ANC suffered its most humiliating defeat at the polls in 30 years as its share of the vote plunged almost 17 percentage points from 57% in 2019 to 40% in 2024. COSATU and the SACP are part of the ANC-led tripartite alliance, which has governed one of Africa's largest economies since the dawn of democracy. With coalition talks taking place, are they going to have an impact on the labor force? Now, joining us this morning to discuss this is Labour analyst Michael Bagraim. Good morning, sir. Welcome to the Breakfast Rush.
Thank you. Good morning, and thank you for having me on air. I really appreciate it.
It's a pleasure and good to see you on camera as well. Now, Michael, given the ANC's loss of its outright majority, how do you foresee the influence of COSATU and the SACP on government policy and legislation changing in practical terms?
Well, it certainly will change. As you know, everything changes. The playing fields are becoming more and more level, and we're seeing a complete sea change in the politics. But that does very strongly influence the trade union movement. You might recall, although you're probably too young, but you might recall in the early 90s and late 80s, in the late 80s, there was a big debate going on about COSATU and government getting into bed together. Now, before then, it was absolutely imperative that the trade union movement played a political role. It was during apartheid. Apartheid had to fall, and you had a legitimate organized body called COSATU, which was the umbrella body of all the trade unions in the country at the time. They were the only umbrella body, and they had a lot of power. And they were instrumental in bringing down apartheid government. I can salute them for that. They were the body that actually caused the fall of the apartheid government. And to a large degree, they helped incredibly with the ANC's campaign at that time under President Mandela to run for political office. You know, the ANC was a disparate group. It hadn't been organized. They didn't have offices and fax machines and computers and all that in those days. And COSATU had it. And they had an office in every little town, and they had organizers and whatever. And it made sense for COSATU to be in bed with the ANC at that time. Very soon thereafter, a debate started whether they should actually get into bed with government, because as you know, government is the biggest employer in South Africa. Now, there's obviously got to be a divide. And the divide is between employer and employee. A trade union exists for employees' rights, for employees' terms and conditions of employment, to push for greater payment, push for better conditions at the workplace. And you've got government on the other hand, which is the employer, which has got a different attitude to all this. So it's a very strange bedfellows where you've got an employer and employee in business together, and it doesn't work. What's happened subsequent to that, to those early heady days of the ANC, what's happened is, of course, many of the COSATU officials and leadership were keen on getting positions in government. They wanted to become ministers in the government, which they did become. They wanted to become MPs, which they did become. And they lost sight of workerist issues. Workerist issues is the bottom line. And so when you have a workerist issue, it can't be bastardized by politics, and it can't be brought down to the level of the employer. You've got to be able to fight on behalf of your
Yes.
membership. And I think they've forgotten about this. There seems to be a big divide. I mean, you might recall about 5 years ago, there was a 3-year agreement between the ANC government and COSATU on the conditions of civil service and increases. And government then reneged. It was quite horrific for me as a labor lawyer to see that they reneged on an agreement that they'd signed. And they said, no, we didn't have authority to sign that. And in fact, they won in the court, in the labor court, the labor appeal court, where they won the case, where they didn't give workers the increase. And then subsequent to that, we've seen massive retrenchments. We've seen workers being ill-treated in the civil service, although they're getting well paid, but they've all been well paid, but they've been ill-treated by the government. So you have this growing divide. Now the ANC is losing power and they're down to 40%. Now they need to rethink this. The COSATU, I think it's good for COSATU because they'll get back to the knitting. They call it get back to the knitting, get back to what their true values are. Their true values are to look after worker rights, to look after the people on the shop floor. And they'd forgotten about all this. The shop stewards, for instance, weren't properly trained. They were trained in politics and not workerist issues. And now we're going to see that divide growing very strongly. They're still in bed together, although COSATU, through its spokesperson, last week, in fact, through its spokesperson said, well, we're very worried as to where we're going now because there's going to be a government of national unity. I think we all accept that. And I think it's wise to have a government of national unity because the voters have spoken. But now the workers need to say to their leadership, forget about your ideals of becoming ministers and MPs and whatever else you want. Let's get back to representing us. And we're going to see that in a big way now. I think COSATU will gain power that way. Yes, there'll be a big drop in power at the moment. They won't have influence over the bargaining councils. They probably won't have that much influence over NEDLAC. And we're going to see those things happening.
Now, speaking of NEDLAC, you were quoted saying that trade unions will still have a voice through bodies like NEDLAC. Can you explain how NEDLAC functions and its role in shaping labor policies in South Africa?
Yeah, it's a superb body. It's a wonderful thing. South Africans are good at negotiations. We have a big background on that. And NEDLAC is set up as a negotiating chamber. In particular, their biggest influence is on labor policy. And it's made up, NEDLAC is made up of employers, big employers, government, and the trade union movement. Now, COSATU was the largest player in the trade union movement. And in fact, they were the only voice at the time. We now have Mr. Vavi, who has entered NEDLAC as well. It's becoming a little bit more representative with Mr. Vavi being there. But that doesn't mean because they're not in partnership or in bed with the ANC, doesn't mean they're going to lose their position around the table. And that discussion table leads to future legislation, future regulations. It's a very well structured. It's part of the Department of Employment and Labour. It's sponsored through government, and it's a very structured negotiating tool, which I, to a large degree, believe has brought labour peace to South Africa. We had horrific labour fallout in the 70s, you might recall, under Willie Madisha, who was head of COSATU at the time. And we had those mass strikes in the hospitals in the cities and whatever. We haven't really had mass strikes like that. Yes, we've had it in the trade union movement and that sort of thing. But I think NEDLAC has done its job. I've been critical of some of the things that they're doing. I do write occasionally to newspapers and whatever about it. I even write to the minister about it. But at the bottom line, they're doing a good job.
So with the ANC needing to compromise with coalition partners, what specific policies or worker rights might be at risk? And how can COSATU effectively protect these?
Well, obviously, they need to come with argument. Today, it's not just political clout. Today, I think it's coming down to what is good for the country and what is good for job creation. You must understand, Our current ANC government has brought us onto our knees in that we've got 40% unemployment, which is the worst in the world, by the way. Now we can only go up. I'm excited about this. I think we're going to go up. And what's going to be challenged, obviously, is initially the Democratic Alliance didn't like the minimum wage, but they've moved away from that. It's probably part of the negotiations where they've said, okay, let's keep the minimum wage. So that's not threatened at this stage. What is threatened, obviously, is the employment equity legislation, but government itself, you will see in the new employment equity legislation, the new regulations are about to come in, government itself has said, let's give small business an exemption. In other words, if you employ under 50 employees, you're exempt from employment equity. So in other words, government itself now is saying the equity legislation seems to be holding back employment creation. And we should be concentrating not on race-based legislation, but concentrating on how do we create jobs. That's the real issue today. And we need a job. We need every person who wants to work to be able to access the workplace. Otherwise, there's no real freedom. You know, this country gained freedom in 94, and that freedom, what does it mean if you haven't got money, if you haven't got a job? It means absolutely nothing. You haven't got a loaf of bread on your table. There's no freedom there. So the only way we're going to really get freedom is not through legislation, not through employment equity legislation. You're going to get it through job creation. When a man, a woman who wants to work can actually enter the workplace, get their daily bread, and then try and improve themselves. We've had 30 wasted years, unfortunately, where people first suffered under apartheid, couldn't access jobs then because they were discriminated against. And now we're not having any job creation at all. It doesn't work. We need to have that job creation because it doesn't matter whether, you know, it's all very well to say, I'm Michael Bagraim, I've got a job, but that doesn't help me if my neighbor's not working, because then they're going to turn to crime, drugs, or whatever, all the horrible things that we're seeing. And it's not the people's fault. I'm blaming government directly. They need to loosen up, take their hands off the throat of job creation.
Now, how might the reduced influence of COSATU and the SACP affect key policies like the national minimum wage and the two-pot retirement system?
Well, the two-pot retirement system has been accepted by every political party. So that's great. In fact, I think it was initially proposed by Dr. Dion George, who's a member of the DA. He suggested that. And it's a good suggestion, because otherwise what we're seeing, and I'm seeing it right now, people are worried about come the 1st of September, there's the two-pot thing. People are saying, I want to resign. I want to get all my pension out. I want to be able to pay off my debt. And they're not thinking about 5 years' time when they might have to retire, then they've spent all their pension. So the two-pot is good, and I think everyone accepts it. It won't affect that. Minimum wage, well, the big proponent against the minimum wage was the DA. They've now taken their hand off that tiller, and they said, okay, let's accept that. It's not so easy anyway to suddenly reduce someone's wage. You can't do that in law. So never mind the fact that you might threaten it. You can't just lower someone's salary anyway. In terms of the Labour Relations Act, and as you know, labour legislation can take years to implement. So I don't think there's a threat to any of that at all. The threat, as I said, is to employment equity, and that's bad legislation. It's social engineering at its worst. So I don't think it's too bad at all. The trade unions, to protect their people, need to get back to actually representing their people. So when there's a wage negotiation, go in and strongly represent. It doesn't matter whether it's government or whether it's your friend. Represent your people. They're your members. They pay your bread and butter. And also, the trade unions need to get together and say, how are we going, if we're going to effectively have power broking and power struggles such as strikes and that sort of thing, let's represent our people. Let's not represent government. It doesn't make sense to represent the person on the other side of the table. So I think COSATU actually is, funnily enough, in that sense, they're going to get more power. They're going to lose their political clout. That's understandable. I don't think the SACP had much hand in that whatsoever. They were actually bit of a spent force, quite frankly. They can't stand alone at all. But COSATU is not a spent force. Unfortunately, people today in modern economy are not joining trade unions so easily, so everyone's numbers are dropping. But that's not through any fault of the politics. That's fault of the economy going forward.
I want to thank you for your time this morning and bringing this information to our listeners. Wish you a wonderful day going forward.
Thank you. Thanks for having me on air. I really appreciate it.
Absolutely our pleasure. That was Labour analyst Michael Bagraim lending his thoughts and knowledge to the subject at hand. How will coalitions affect the Labour force? It's your breakfast rush. Hopefully that's answered one or two questions that you may have had in mind with regard to that as well. Still to come on your TBR this morning, what screening, diagnostics and treatments does the Heart and Healthcare Centre have to offer our listeners? We're talking with Dr. Rakesh Mohanlal on the show not too long from now. But right now, we're getting ready for Vodacom.
The Breakfast.